Great. Good afternoon, all. Thank you all for joining. This is our stakeholder meeting to talk about methane emissions from landfills in terms of how this meeting is going to progress. MDE will first and foremost do a presentation, and then we'll allow input for stakeholder input and discussion. Before that, our Air Director, Tad Abrams, will give an introduction. We'll go around the room introducing ourselves with those who are present here, and followed by those who are on the phone. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tad Abrams to say a few words. We'll go around introducing ourselves. Folks on the phone will introduce themselves, and then I'll go through the presentation.
Okay, well, my name is Pat Abrams. I'm the Air Director with MDE. See some familiar faces. So I wear many hats. I guess today's hat is mostly representing the Maryland Climate Change Commission. My boss, Ben Grumbles, chairs the Maryland Climate Change Commission. We in Maryland have a 2009 and 2016 law that requires us to achieve a 25% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, including methane, by 2020. And then in 2016, they changed the law, added a reduction requirement, 40% reduction by 2030 to the law. As part of our Climate Commission work, we have another law that's set up, the Maryland Climate Commission. So it's a commission that's established by law. And one of their highest priorities in 2015 and 16 was to look at a whole host of methane issues. Everything from what's going on with methane sources in our own state, Maryland, and that's sort of why we're here today. We've taken a look at areas that we'd like to look at. And then we're supposed to be looking at things like methane releases in areas upwind of us, like Pennsylvania, West Virginia, who are actively doing hydraulic fracturing. So we got a lot on our plate in terms of methane. It's been a really high priority. It was in both our, if you want to look at our 2015 and 2016 commission reports, you can sort of see the charge that we were given. So what we've done at MDE is we've looked in state and we said, where should we be looking to perhaps tighten up our requirements for reducing leaking methane? And we know there's a new federal rule coming, and so this is an opportunity to sit down with the landfill community and talk about how that's going to work and what else we might be able to do. And so that's why we're here today, is to have that very first discussion on options to further minimize emissions of methane from landfills. And we already know that almost all of our landfills have systems that capture and collect and sometimes use as fuels the methane. So we know we've got a good starting point, and we're really looking for where to go from here. So this is our first meeting. So I don't have a draft reg today. So we're hoping just to gather information, give you guys a feel for what we're looking at, and take it from there. We also have some folks from the University of Maryland who have been doing some very interesting research on methane, which is still making me scratch my head a little bit trying to figure out what I'm seeing. So anyway, that's it. Before we jump into the around the table introduction, any questions about the commission or the general reason for why we're here? It's a little different because this is a state law, not a federal law that's driving us to be here. Yeah, we know we got the federal requirements to meet. We have to do that. This is driven by a state law. We don't have EPA involved. We can go wherever we want to go. So, questions about what we're doing, where we're coming from? If not, why don't we just do around the table introductions? Again, I'm Tad Abrams. I'm the Air Director for the state of Maryland. I'm also the lead staff for the Climate Commission. I also chair a group called the Mitigation Working Group, which is one of the subcommittees of the Climate Commission that's looking at this kind of stuff. What can we do to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
All right, I'm Jacob Shepard. I'm with SCS Engineers.
Darren Dilla with SCS Engineers also. Martha Henson, I'm Chief of the Solid Waste Operations Division with MDE.
Edward M. Dexter, Administrator of the Solid Waste Program for MDE.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Seelock. I work here at MDE. I'm a regulatory and compliance engineer.
Matt Hafner, MDE Air Quality Permit. Chris Beck, MDE Climate Change Division.
Randy Mosier, Chief of Regulations Development Division.
I'm Doyan from University of Maryland.
Jonathan Hansford, also from University of Maryland.
I'm Leah Kelly. I'm an attorney with the Environmental Integrity Project.
John Paul, Baltimore City. Joshua Chauvin, Regulation Development Division here at MDE.
Jeffrey Dan, Howard County.
Katie Blackwell, also with Howard County.
Andrew Case from Northeast Maryland Waste Disposal Authority.
From the Minus Program. John Artis, MDE Air Compliance. Ready to rank MDE.
Great. If we can have the folks who are on the phone, please introduce yourself, your name, the company you're representing, and what role you're playing there.
Marilyn Ryback, Prince George's County.
And you have to announce yourself because we have your name on the webinar.
Dusty Hilbert, Carroll County, Bureau of Solid Waste.
Mridula Gupta from KCI Technologies.
Chinglin from University of Maryland.
Elena Jimmy, Chesapeake Bay Foundation.
This is Darrell Flick from
Max.
Prince George's County, Maryland.
Jesse Maxwell, Solid Waste Association of North America.
Anybody else?
Martha Ainsworth, Prince George's Sierra Club, and the Zero Waste Committee of the Maryland chapter of the Sierra Club.
Corey Davio, Baltimore County, Solid Waste.
Jeff Schoenberger, Hartford County.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you all one more time. We appreciate your time. Thanks for joining in person or via webinar. I'll go through the presentation now. I hope everybody who's on the line can hear me nice and clear. So we're trying to address methane from landfills. As Tad mentioned, this is an issue that we're looking into that's being driven by a lot of the work that the Maryland Commission on Climate Change is doing and some of the revelations that some of their work and reports are indicating and showing. First and foremost, we'll go through very quickly the work that the Maryland Commission on Climate Change is doing, some background on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act. Also, we'll take a look at some of the national methane emissions as well as Maryland methane emissions, both that we have discovered, and we'll take that opportunity to hear some of the research that's being done by the University of Maryland. We'll go through and give a high-level overview of EPA's rules and the actions that they've taken to address landfill gas at municipal solid waste landfills. We'll talk about some of our objectives and then round it off with next steps. So as Tad mentioned, the Maryland Commission on Climate Change was originated in 2007. They were really charged with identifying the different drivers of climate change, its implication in the state of Maryland, and really developing an implementation plan. This led to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act of 2009, which we shall go through next. But really the core of the plan was that Maryland had to drive down greenhouse gas emissions by 25% from 2006 levels by the year 2009. Their work eventually led to enhancements of the 2009 Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, now called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act of 2016, which was signed last year in April. This enhanced the goal from 25% by 2020 to 40% by the year 2030. So once again, this is really what's driving Maryland's work. The charge of the commission was to provide recommendations on how to reduce greenhouse gas in state and also adapt to the effects and impacts of climate change. So as I mentioned, it was originally adapted. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act was originally adapted in 2009. Mentioned the 25% by 2020, and sat through a presentation, I think, last week, where it seems like Maryland is on track to reach this goal, which is good news for us. The law also requires, and this is an important piece of the law, that the plan supports a healthy economy and also create new jobs. So we want to ensure that the work that's coming out of the law will have a net benefit when it comes to supporting and sustaining Maryland's economy. As I mentioned, it was enhanced recently to try to achieve a 40% greenhouse gas emissions reductions from 2006 levels by the year 2030, with the same focus on economy and jobs. So one of the reports that came out of the Maryland Commission on Climate Change was released last year, and they listed out 40 recommendations on what Maryland can do in-house to really address climate change. And it also included information on mitigation, adaptation, education, communication, and outreach. One was particularly and very specific to in-state emission reductions, including really looking into the high methane emitters in state from compressor stations, landfills, and wastewater treatment plants. So this is a look at the national methane emissions, which were released by the United States EPA in 2014. As you can see, I think we have a laser. There we go. From the oil and natural gas sector, that was the highest source category of methane emissions, followed by enteric fermentation, and then landfills coming in at number 3. Maryland methane emissions from our inventory tells a very similar story, where the oil and natural gas industry occupies about a third of the methane emissions that we discovered in state. Agriculture is coming next, followed by waste management, which composes both of landfills or municipal solid waste landfills as well as wastewater treatment. So Maryland, seeing that these are the 3 biggest pieces of our pie, we felt it was important to start there when it comes to addressing methane emissions from these source categories. Researchers from the University of Maryland are also looking into this issue, so I'm going to welcome Doyen, forgive me if I didn't pronounce your name correctly, and Jonathan to speak about the next couple of slides.
Yep, so I'm Doyen, and
I'm Jonathan.
we're from University of Maryland, and we do the research on methane emission happening in Washington, D.C., Baltimore area. We're going to show 2 slides which are summarizing our work. We had multiple research aircraft campaigns over the last few years, and the aircraft was equipped with different instruments to measure methane concentration and also other greenhouse gases and meteorological variables. And what you're seeing in this slide is 2 maps. You can see the Washington, D.C. here and the Baltimore city, and you see 5 black diamonds, which have its own numbers. And those diamonds represent the locations of one of the largest landfills in the state of Maryland. The number 1 landfill here is the Central Sanitary Landfill. They reported about 6,000 metric tons of methane per year to US EPA reporting program. And what you see here is the aircraft track. So aircraft was flying, our research aircraft was flying from south right here, along with this line to the north. And we colored the aircraft track by the measured concentration of the methane. So if the color of this aircraft track is blue, that means aircraft was seeing the low concentration of methane. If the color is red, that means there was high spike of the methane. And you can see that there was one spike of methane measured in here, and we tried to understand where that high spike of methane is coming from. So we used transport models to see where the air parcel was coming from. And these lines were showing the trajectory of the air parcel. So you can see that the high spike of methane right here was actually coming from the ground station landfill, which is number 2 Black Diamond right here. This is, I forgot to mention, this is February 20, 2015. This is 5 days after. So 5 days after, aircraft was flying from the north to the south along with this track. And again, aircraft was able to capture the high concentration of methane at this location. And when we did a transport modeling analysis, you can see that the air was coming from this trajectory, and the air was going above number 3 landfill, which is the Eastern Sanction landfill. So these are the 2 cases which shows we see the methane plumes coming out from the landfills, but we also see the methane plumes from other landfills in other days, and we can use those measurement data sets and some mathematical equations to estimate the emission rate of each landfill. This slide summarizes our calculation results, and Jonathan is going to explain this table.
So as Do-Yeon explained, we can, once we've identified where these high plumes of methane are coming from by using the wind data and the measured concentration of methane, we can compute how much methane is coming out of each individual landfill. One thing to note is that the largest landfill that we sampled in terms of methane emissions was Ground Station landfill, which is in Prince George's County, Maryland. That landfill was emitting a fairly significant amount of methane compared to any other landfill that we sampled. Perhaps another thing to note is that the standard deviation of these numbers is actually quite high, that while we do see a significant amount of methane coming out of the landfill, there's also a large amount of variability, some of which we don't fully understand yet in terms of just on different days, the landfill will be emitting much more methane than on other days, sometimes a factor of 2 or 3 more. And these numbers here that we've computed for these landfills, if you compare our numbers to the numbers that the EPA inventory gives, the EPA computes its inventory of landfills based on equations of how much waste went in, how old is the landfill, and essentially attempts to parametrically model the emissions, that our numbers from observations are higher than the EPA's inventory by about a factor of 3. So there may be a lot more CH4 coming out of these facilities than we previously had believed.
And I think the bottom line is that there are observable methane emissions coming from landfills, kind of confirming what the inventory is really saying about where emissions within in the state of Maryland are coming from. Yes, ma'am.
Aren't many of these required to report their methane emissions directly to MDE as part of their Title V permit?
Yes, every year they're required to submit annual reports that details, or at least quantifies their methane emissions.
So just so I understand this, there's a plane flying over the space, and you are taking instantaneous readings. So it's a one-time measurement as you fly. So there's a lot of variability to that, right? I mean, we've observed that emissions from landfills is dependent on, for example, weather conditions, barometric pressure, wind conditions. So some of that stuff go into the estimates.
So right now we actually didn't take into account. I did try to do an analysis to see if barometric pressure was correlated with the emissions that we calculated, and the work that I did on that seemed to indicate that there wasn't much of a correlation, although there has been other research that has stated that there is a correlation between pressure change and emissions. We have not factored that into these numbers, though.
And to add on that, that's a really good question. So you can see the number of transects and flights next to the name of the landfill. That represents how many times aircraft was flying nearby the landfill. For example, ground station, the aircraft was flying by the ground station landfill 27 times in 10 different days. So, but the caveat is those 10 research flights was occurring on February. So if there is significant seasonal variability of methane emission from the landfill, that is not taken into account in this calculation. And we are planning to do further research, further aircraft campaigns during the other seasons, like summer or spring and fall. That's our plan.
You are measuring like a ppm or ppb number, and you are...
We are trying to measure the landfill plume in ppm in different altitudes nearby the landfill, and using mathematical equations to interpolate our measurements to represent the entire emission.
So with respect to the Brown Station Road sanitary landfill, did you take into consideration like the area rubble fill that's in as our neighbor?
Yeah. We use transfer modeling to separate methane spikes to the other possible emission sources. So we are doing this calculation only for the methane signals that can be solely attributed to specific landfill. Is that your question?
Yeah, we're trying to, as whether or not, I just want to make sure that the numbers that you show on your chart, do they reflect Brown Station Road specifically, or are there contributing factors from our neighboring rubble fill?
Yes. So let me add on this Xingrong. So we use a mass balance approach to calculate those methane emissions from landfill. So the background actually is subtract from the methane peak. So if there's anything for the neighborhood from natural gas system or something like that, it will be already subtracted. So those numbers are the net emission of methane from those landfills based on our aircraft measurements.
So there is some influence.
It's already been subtract because the peak is so large. Actually, there's no way there's if there's some neighborhood around, it will be already in the background. So we already subtract those background from the calculation. So those already be taken into account.
Okay.
Those numbers doesn't include any of those background emissions.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I think what the mayor in Prince George's say is right. Within a mile or so from Prince George's, there's another large C&D landfill. How did you account for other emission sources that's nearby? There's probably wastewater plants, other landfills. How could you?
Is that Brown Station and vicinity, or is that Brown Station itself? That's the question. For instance, Quarantine Road, if you've been there and you know the history of the area around Quarantine Road, there are 7 closed landfills, all bordering the city's Quarantine Road landfill. There's an FCM, there's a MES hazardous waste facility, there's the paint facility that was across the way. So there's 7 landfills that are right there. So that was the question. Is he breaking that apart to Quarantine Road City landfill separate from the other landfills that are right there, or is that vicinity? Because you're up on, you're up several hundred, we could say vicinity, that's cool. Because then, although everyone will want to blame everyone else for all the methane emissions, you at least know that it's that vicinity that we want to work on. So that was the question that I think Prince George's County was asking the same thing. Is this a vicinity issue? Because that's how the flight over is going to give us a vicinity, not necessarily. That was the question, and I guess I'm getting nods from the people here that it is, yes, that's a vicinity issue, not necessarily a specific. We've taken account of all of the adjoining properties, and it's not there.
Yes, there's because we're flying perhaps 50 kilometers downwind at some time, it's difficult to distinguish facilities that are right next to each other. But the Brown Station peak we observe is only in terms of flight time, we observe it on the order of approximately a minute. So really it is Washington, D.C. is not getting put into Brown Station. If there's another facility that's right across the street from Brown Station, we're not going to be able to tell the difference.
Yes, that's definitely true. So we actually, on the airplane, I was on the airplane many times. So we actually, lots of time we can see the landfill, Brown Station landfill very clearly. So, and a few times we actually, only a few miles away from the landfill. So there's no way, and since the Brown Station landfill is probably the largest in the Prince George County. So there's no way, the methane, plume we observed could come from other landfills if they are, a few miles away from the Brown Station landfill.
I guess another way to look at it, if we have several facilities next to each other, will you be able to specifically identify this is from site A, that's from site B, that's from site C? Unless you are able to specifically identify each one of them, you are really not getting a specific reading of each site. You are getting a summation of facts from all sites.
Right.
Yeah, that will depending, how far. Yeah, I think Jonathan also mentioned how far. If there are two or three landfills next to each other, if they only maybe a few hundred meters away, then by the methane emissions from those three landfills, after they travel a few miles downwind, then it probably will mix each other. But if the landfills, let's say, are 10, 20 miles away, then we will definitely be able to separate those plumes from aircraft measurements.
Yeah, the other thing I see here is a huge standard deviation, right, on each of these measurements. Look at Eastern Sanitary Landfill, for example. I take in some cases it was almost zero, right? One standard deviation.
That is actually.
Next day it was, so there's a huge variability.
Yes, so that's exactly right. So I think we it's as a minimum, working with the landfill, probably know the landfill methane emissions are really depending on the barometric pressure. So when the pressure is decreasing, then we'll have more methane coming out. If the pressure is increasing, then have less methane coming out. I think those variabilities reflecting those variation of emissions, depending on the meteorological condition differences. You would expect those methane emission will be different. And one thing I think Jonathan also mentioned these are based on the winter flights we did. So we are going to do some more flights over during the spring and later on the summer. So we will get more data. So try to see if they capture any of seasonal or seasonal variations, and also from day-to-day variations.
I didn't do well in school in statistics, but I'm looking at these numbers. You got the mean and you got standard deviation. And some of the standard deviations even higher than the mean. What does that mean?
So in that case, so one way to get a standard deviation like that is if you've had a lot of very low measurements and then a few very high measurements. And for Quarantine Road, that is actually exactly what we see. There were a few measurements that were very, very large, while most of the measurements were smaller.
What does that mean in real life? I mean, the site is there, right? And unless something happens, why do we have such huge variation?
That is a question we don't know the answer to right now. It could be meteorological conditions or perhaps something else going on at the landfill.
Yeah, I actually have one related question to those who are operating the landfills. So I know some of the landfills has a methane correction system. Do you guys actually see, how much? Do you know how much methane you are collecting? And do you see any, diurnal or seasonal variations, something like that?
So yes, anyone who has a collection system has some type of metering device to be able to determine how much they collect.
Right.
That is correct. Now, and then I was going to bring this up later, the amount of fugitive methane that we list that is reported. So EPA created this model based in the early 90s that estimates based on the waste amount that came into the landfill how much waste methane is going to be generated. Now remember that these numbers were generated, this model was generated in the 90s. So it was looking at landfills that were 10, 20, 30, and 40 years old. So we're talking about waste that is, in worst case, was put in landfills in the 50s. Now, what we produce and put in our landfills now in 2015 is significantly different than what we put in landfills in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so what's interesting is, so that can thus change the amount that the EPA model is actually projecting that we're producing. The other thing is, we know how much we actually capture and burn. So then what EPA has us do is take this theoretical model, if it's right or if it's not, subtract the amount that we know that we capture, and then EPA proclaims that everything that the difference between the two is what is fugitive gases. Now that can have, that's assuming that the model is right. But that's assuming that they were looking at, we have many landfills that are closed landfills now that are on 30 years, 40 years after we took waste blasts, or at least 25 years afterwards. And so that's all the question of what do these models do. We're shocked to hear that we're at 60% capture rate, and we think we're running our gas systems great, and the models are telling us that there's all this gas out there that we're not collecting, and we're going, how can this be? So, that becomes the question. Now I got to get back to your question of the question then comes, and we do know that especially closed landfills that are not actively producing but are on the tail end of their production rates are significantly impacted by weather conditions. Ask the field guys who balance the well field, and many of them on the closed landfills will say, November, April, we get this huge turnover, and all of a sudden, all the wells that were doing great are now closing off, and all the ones that were closed off now all of a sudden producing gas like mad. And there's this huge turnover, at least in my experience with several closed landfills, is there's this seasonal turnover of production. So these flights are great, but we need to then look at which season are they in, and maybe be able to look at them from a yearly point of view. But I think I want to bring up the point, and then that becomes this: what is fugitive, at least from the landfill's production point of view, is the difference between what EPA says that we should be producing and what we've measured as actually destroyed. And so it's really dependent upon, did EPA get the right model? And then if I'm hearing correctly, if you're saying in some of these cases, the fugitive amounts to 2 to 3 times what the EPA model is, then clearly there's a disconnect because we think the EPA model is skyrocketing high, and the actual measurements are coming out completely different. So that is a clear thing that's got to be resolved before we can really figure out how to fine tune how the landfills are working. Is we got to get that disconnect going on between the two. Sorry, Jeff, for those on the phone, this is Jeff Dan of Howard County.
Any other last minute comments, questions? Jonathan, thank you so much.
So I wanted to let everybody else say their 2 cents just a little bit in terms of how this links to our effort on tightening up regulations and sort of working on voluntary programs in a harder way. It doesn't really relate that much at all. It just says there's really something we need to be looking at, okay? We're not driving our regulation by emissions. We're driving our regulation by state-of-the-art controls on landfills. So that's where we're going to, it just is a good example of the interest in this issue, and that there clearly are things that we need to be trying to figure out. I mean, that's why when I introduced this piece, I said, I'm still scratching my head a little bit over exactly what's going on, because I had some of the same questions that you guys raised. So it's an important piece. It's of great interest to the research community. Leah is here today, but she is a mild-mannered environmentalist compared to CCAN on this particular issue. You know, Mike Tidwell has become a beating drum on methane as part of the commission. But again, our job, this is all stuff we need to figure out. Gives us some good questions to try to think about, but in the long run, it probably doesn't really have a huge role in the regs or the programs we implement. It does ask questions. Like, you know, the first thing I thought was, why here and not there? You know, what's going on? So we're still trying to make sure we understand it and what it implies. Are there sources that we don't have in our inventory? This is one of the questions that I ask my staff. Are there things that we're not capturing in our inventory that, you know? So anyway, that's where MDE is coming from. Really important information. But in the long run, our job is to make sure that the systems in the landfills are representative of state-of-the-art ways to capture and use and get rid of methane. So
this is a very tough question, but sometimes whenever we look at data that somehow we don't feel comfortable with, and we look at has the sensor been calibrated right?
Yeah, Maryland guys, Maryland folks, the question, I think these are pretty good sense. The measurement techniques are pretty solid, right? That was the question that came up, is are the measurement tools fairly well established as being accurate? I think these are.
Yeah. In terms of measurement techniques, the uncertainty reported is about 1 ppb methane. So if you take into account that, those numbers are going to be changing like 0.5% or even lower than that. So measurement itself is accurate.
It's not spec of the measurement, it's calibration of the instrument.
Yeah, we bring our instruments to the NIST, which is National Institute of Technology, so we are sure about our measurement techniques.
I mean, I see the measurement being one thing, but a measurement, you know, set in a mile in the air or however high compared to a measurement at the surface, you got to get that measurement from there down to what's coming from the landfill, and that would be interesting to see how you take that and model it down to the landfill level. I see a lot of variability in going from the landfill all the way up to a point or a track over the area.
So I was going to offer at the end of the meeting, because I know we got more to go through today, but if anyone was interested in a follow-up session to focus on this specific issue or other specific issues, we're happy to do that. And I think the University of Maryland, this happens to be research that I'm not paying the University of Maryland to do. I do pay them to do research, basically to look at ways for me to point figures at Pennsylvania power plants. But this is research that they're doing, and they would probably love to understand from your perspective additional things that would be good to try to get out of the research. So if we ever wanted to do that, I would offer a separate session to just talk about that. Make sense? Okay.
So continuing on, in terms of EPA initiatives and some of the actions that they have taken, last August they finalized the new source performance standards for municipal solid waste landfills. They also issued emission guidelines for reducing landfill gas from existing landfills. I'll talk about both rules in just a second. For the NSPS, or the new source performance standards for the new landfills, they updated it from the last time the NSPS was updated in 1996. It's now 40 CFR Part 60 Subpart XXX, and this applies to landfills that underwent construction, reconstruction, or modification after July 17, 2014. In terms of 40 CFR Part 60 Subpart XXW, that's eventually still going to continue to apply as we're transitioning, or EPA and its facilities are transitioning over kind of to the new rules. And for existing landfills, Subpart CC, which was the previous emission guideline that applied to any facility that accepted waste after November 1987, but prior to 1991, is now the new Subpart CF, or the new emission guideline, focuses on landfills that accepted waste after the November 8, 1987 date, and that has commenced construction or reconstruction or modification before the NSPS takes over, which is July 17, 2014. Clean Air Act Section 111D requires states to submit plans detailing implementation for EGs for existing landfills. So that's part of the things that we're working on, is we're going to eventually be developing a rule to address the emission guidelines that we are required to submit our plans to EPA for.
So Jonathan, hold on, let me see if Josh?
Yeah.
Sorry, Jeff Nance again, Howard County. The new EPA regs are demanding that the state develop a plan, and then they list all these requirements. So the state may do those exact requirements and then push them down as a mirrored version, or they make it tighter. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, so states have the ability, if I heard your question correctly, the state's flexibility in terms of implementing the emission guidelines. EPA has a set of guidelines that states can follow. We have to follow those, at least follow those emission guidelines, but we have the flexibility of making more stringent requirements for landfills. Does that answer your question?
Okay, yeah.
Okay. And in terms, both rules, the NSPS and EG, new source performance standards for new sources, and emission guidelines for existing sources, EPA has identified that a well-designed and a well-operated landfill gas collection and control system is the best system of emission reductions for controlling landfill gas in these facilities. A summary of the rules, and both subparts are pretty much similar in their requirements. Both rules reduces the non-methane organic compound emission threshold that would trigger the requirement to install a gas collection and gas control system from 50 megagrams per year to 34 megagrams per year. Once again, non-methane organic compound, or landfill gas, comprises mostly of methane and non-methane organic compound, including VOCs and hazardous air pollutants. Another requirement that it now provides, they provide an optional method for determining when a landfill must install and operate a gas collection and gas control system. This methodology is known as Tier 4, which is based on surface emission monitoring of methane. The threshold is about 100 ppm. So previously, there were 3 modeled approaches that landfills would use if they fell within the design capacity to install a gas collection and gas control system. If there were 2.5 million megagrams, if they had 2.5, rewind and play. If they had a design capacity of 2.5 million megagrams, they were required to actually perform a calculation to determine if the non-methane organic compound emission rate would trigger for them to install a system. That number is also 2.5 million cubic meters of waste. And this, the rule also clarifies control options for gas collection and gas control systems. Pretty much if a landfill uses one of the methodologies and determines that they are required to install a gas collection and gas control system, there was some confusion in terms of what are the options available in terms of after you collect the gas, what to do with it. EPA clarified that pretty much facilities have one of 3 options. One is to route it to a non-enclosed flare. The second is to route it to some type of controlled combustion device. And the third option is to actually direct it to a treatment system that would produce gas that can be used beneficially for the facility or be sold to some other facility. They also required, new rules provided a little bit of regulatory relief for landfills previously at the wellhead. Landfills that had these systems installed had to monitor nitrogen levels, oxygen levels, the temperature, as well as maintain positive pressure at wellheads. There were operational standards that existed for those 4 parameters. Now, EPA is requiring that landfills simply monitor and record nitrogen and oxygen levels, so there's no operational standard attached to this, but they retain the requirement to monitor temperature and pressure at wellheads and also perform corrective actions if the operations of at a facility exceed the standards for temperature, or if a facility identifies positive pressure at wellheads. The rules also require that landfill owners and operators monitor surface emissions of methane quarterly. This is pretty much a retention of what existed in the previous NSPS in terms of quarterly monitoring of methane emissions. And it has to, as I mentioned before, the threshold for determining whether or not corrective action needs to take place is 500 ppm of methane. It includes criteria for capping or removing a landfill gas collection or gas control system. The 3 pretty much requirements are: 1, that the landfill needs to be closed. 2 is that the gas collection and gas control system needed to be operating for at least 15 years. Or if a facility can show that there's declining landfill gas flows, then that would also qualify as well for determining whether or not a facility can cap or remove a landfill gas collection and gas control system. As I mentioned, with the clarifying control options for the system, there's a new definition for landfill gas treatment and treatment system monitoring plant, in which a facility has the ability to determine to make a site-specific treatment plan for their facility, and also consistent with EPA's kind of startup shutdown and malfunction policy, standards of performance apply at all times. In terms of our objectives, as we mentioned before, what we really want to do is revise our current reg, which is COMAR 2611-1920, which is control of landfill gas emissions from solid waste landfills. We want to at least match federal rules and based on kind of our discussions to see if there's any other available options for us to really address methane emissions that are coming from landfills. And also to understand current landfill operations, especially those that have voluntarily installed gas collections, gas control systems. We've discovered that a lot of facilities, part of the reason because of migration issues of gas, as well as odor control, have voluntarily kind of installed gas collection and gas control systems. They would not be required to do kind of the reporting and the monitoring that those who are required to have these systems installed to undergo. And so therefore, we want a better understanding of what and how industry operations kind of match or compare against kind of federal requirements. That would be of interest to the state of Maryland. In terms of our tentative regulations timeline, we're hoping, today is the stakeholder meeting, we're hoping to have some form or to develop a draft regulation by June of this year. Proposed regulations to our Air Quality Control Advisory Council by early fall. Have a notice of proposed action in November, and the following up with the public hearing by the end of the year. We're hoping to finalize the reg by early next year and finally submit our state implementation plan to the EPA in April of 2018.
So that submission of your plan to EPA in April 18, and then it would have to be rolled out to those persons or those agencies that had to comply. Right?
Yeah, so pretty much.
So compliance is not on that list of 1 to 7.
Yeah, so pretty much what happens after we submit our plan to the EPA is that EPA has 4 months to approve of our plan, and pretty much enforcement would take place kind of based on the date that we place inside of the rule itself. So compliance would start sometime next year.
Joshua, is this state implementation plan for both the NSPS XXX and the EG?
For those facilities that are subject to the NSPS, they're actually supposed to be compliant now. So those facilities who underwent construction, reconstruction, or are new or modified, you have to actually comply to the NSPS. But this would apply for those existing facilities that would be subject to the emission guidelines. The compliance date would be sometime in the next year's time frame. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that was good.
Let me read, because I didn't get that. So those who are not covered by NSPS now, but because they're tightening the guidelines, would then be required to fit under NSPS, then that is after, you're still looking at 2018 then having to have that ready to roll.
Yes. However, because NSPS for the previous NSPS subpart W applies to facilities who accepted rates after 1987, but prior to 2014, pretty much that would be the regulatory rule that that existing facilities should follow up until the development and implementation of our rules. Does that answer your question?
So the old NSPS.
So the old NSPS is now the rule for existing sources until the state finalizes ours.
If you were within that 87 to 2014.
You think?
Well, it just means because we're voluntary and we were too small before.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds like, from what we're looking at it sounds like we're now, because they made the rule, the cutoff for smaller, we fit under that category of not before, but now.
Okay.
Okay, does that make any sense?
In terms of your non-methane organic compound emission rate calculation.
It's the walk the landfill thing that's going to get added to it.
Okay.
Okay, and so that's my question: is when is this walk the landfill thing going to hit us?
Okay. So pretty much it will start from the moment that your non-methane organic compound emission rate reaches the threshold of 50 if you are under the old rules, or the new NSPS 34. I'm sorry.
That's when the threshold is going to hit us.
No? Yeah, if you are reclassified as a XXX, then 50 immediately.
pretty much a facility has to determine whether or not they fall under NSPS or if they're an existing source prior to and using the July 17th, 2014 date. That would kind of determine whether or not you're required. Exactly.
Okay. Hey, Josh, based on the data we have, we're not picking up anybody's queue, are we?
Not based on the data that we have proposed. Yeah, we have not, at least based on our assessment, doesn't seem like anybody will be NSPS in the state of Maryland. However, I'm not sure if your operations will think what's going on actually at these landfills. I mean, you guys would know whether or not you would fall under the new or old.
This question really is for you. My question probably is the field. That in real life, we do everything we are to do. If we have the money and we want to operate on the premise, right? Want to be on good side of yours. Now, most of the time we operate under physical constraint. So I would recommend when you roll out regulation, take that into consideration. That if you roll it out today, and we probably will not be able to even put in funding requests until next fiscal year. That's how the physical budgetary process. I'm sure that's operating.
Yeah, no, you can expect us to work through those types of issues with you. But what Josh was saying was that one of the pieces of our regulation development will be a compliance schedule, and we will talk about all those issues. And we've been through that many times. So,
I have a question. So as far as we understand it, both W and XXX are still in effect. There's no mechanism the EPA has created to say one replaces the other. You had a comment earlier that you were expecting you said CF to replace CC. Does that mean that your state implementation plan will have provisions to basically exempt those that are part of CF, exempt them from CC requirements? Because there's still some disparities between the two regulations that, as far as determining if one's more conservative or not. So will your state plan, do you plan to have some kind of thing in there to replace, to exempt CF from CC landfills?
As in direct language to specific language to maintain exemptions that were previously in CF?
No, as far as there's nothing, the way it was written, there's nothing in there that says that those that become subject to subpart C little f are then not subject to big C little t. So is there anything in the plan that you're saying, is that why you're saying that they will replace them, that you're planning to write into the plan to facilitate that?
I see. So your comment is pretty much, is there something specific that Maryland's going to incorporate in our regs to directly address that the rules that we write will replace the existing rule?
Right.
Pretty much, it's kind of implied whenever we develop a new rule, it's going to even CC being the old emission guidelines, those it left it up to states to kind of develop whatever plan, whatever rule that they were going to make, and then facilities were subject to the state rules. So CC is going to be the same thing now that states are empowered to kind of write the rules. Whatever rules that we write would naturally replace our existing rules.
Okay.
So for the state of Maryland, our rule in 2611-1920 was identical, mirrored the emission guidelines, the previous emission guidelines. We project that we'll be doing something similar in terms of the applicability for landfills.
So that old state plan would not be in effect anymore?
Exactly, because it's going to be replaced by the new rule that we developed.
Okay.
Which means the timeline changes also for the, for you to submit the various submissions. You got to repeat that
Yes, so in terms of, we'll be sure to be clear in terms of what reports are due when. So we're going to include that. We tend to do that in our technical support document for any rule, is we'll be sure to give very specific and clear instructions that the transition times from the old rules and new rules and when the different reports will be required.
You will take into account during transition period.
Hey, but that, I mean, I always hate it when we get too distracted by the federal requirement, because we are going to be looking beyond the federal requirement. So we will work extremely hard to make sure that the federal rule that replaces the old federal rule doesn't create stupid duplication of effort type things. We will definitely do that. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But I will also, I think, I would be interested in getting feedback on issues like if this unit, if this landfill is doing this because of the new federal rule, and this one isn't, but it is eminently logical that this one could do it, why aren't we going to do it? So we will be going through, we will be looking at that. Now that may be a state requirement only, not a federal requirement, but we will be looking at that because the methane issue is one that's really being driven by a state law, not, yes, it's the federal law that's driving a lot of the action right now, but we're also looking to go beyond that. I will be asking tough questions like, you know, it seems to me that this is, I'm no expert on landfills, but it seems to me that that this is, it reminds me very much of some of the LiDAR programs we do with leaking fugitive emissions pipelines and everything. And it is really a function of if the equipment works right, it's going to work right. But sometimes it doesn't work right, so you got to have systems to check to see if it's worked right. When the system's checked and it's not working right, then you have a schedule where you fix it and all that kind of stuff. I'd love to see if there's, and you guys do quarterly testing, right?
In the quarterly
Under the current NSPS?
We're active landfill. Closed landfills can get it.
Can any of these new low-cost sensors help us do that continuously? Have I looked at that? This whole, this huge, there's this huge movement with low-cost sensors, and methane's one of the things that people are looking at. And so there's the kind of questions that I'm going to be asking throughout this process. And that goes above and beyond federal requirements. I wouldn't require it if it doesn't make sense or it's absurdly expensive. But we will be asking those questions.
Yeah, kind of the way the surface emissions monitoring works is, you know, a human's walking with a machine and taking samples, you know, every 100 feet or so around the landfill. So to convert that 100 feet, you know, so it could be thousands of samples, right, or hundreds of samples that someone's taken. It's tough to look at those hundreds of samples and say that one sensor is going to replace that. I'm just to give you a sense of what we are looking at here. But that would be great if you could convert that to one sensor and MD agrees with it. I'm sure.
Well, I was actually thinking of like a bunch of sensors. Or, you know, some of the sensors are $50. Now, my opinion is some of the low-cost sensors don't give you PPB, they give you indications, they give you indicators. And in this world, the indicator of an issue that needs to be fixed is just as good as having the PPB sometimes. Anyway, we'll talk about this.
Would MPE consider doing a pilot?
Yeah.
And doing a pilot and then maybe work well and roll it out?
Yeah, we would. Not on the NSPS, that's mandatory, but on some of the more questionable, innovative things, we would certainly consider both a pilot and consider starting off with voluntary efforts. So,
once MPE as a pilot was successful, we thought easier for us to go back to our bosses to say, yeah, there's a low-cost solution.
So just so I understand, you're planning to come out with a draft SIP by the June 2017 so that it could be discussed among the stakeholders again at that point?
A draft rule. So in terms of the state implementation plan, that is going to be developed by the end of the year, but the rule is pretty much going to be what we'll be submitting to EPA.
Well, in all honesty, I've done this a long time. In my experience, sometimes you don't get the dialogue until you have a draft reg out. So that's we will be issuing a draft reg, and that really gets people's attention relatively quickly. Doesn't mean it's a done deal, but it is going to be something that we get a lot of reaction when we have a draft reg.
So the draft reg would be by hopefully early summer.
Okay,
and the reg eventually down the road, at least for the federal NSPS, gets submitted to EPA to be included in the state implementation plan that's required under the Clean Air Act. That doesn't mean a unique state requirement has to be in that piece submitted to the feds. Now, Leah's folks want it there because then they can sue EPA over it. but we'll have that discussion, you know. It's all for a good process.
So is there maybe a thought of having something like a comment period on the draft, as far as like not just us sitting in a meeting discussing it over, but maybe like a written comment period that you plan to have?
Almost definitely. Whenever we're developing regulations and whenever we have stakeholder meetings.
So that step where it says public hearing, usually that's also linked to a formal public comment period.
Okay.
Usually the formal public comment period will go 30 days beyond the public hearing in December 2017. And all schedules are meant to drive things. And so schedules sometimes slip. We will work really hard to keep to this, but if things slip, it will happen. We use our schedules to drive fast progress.
And with any of our rule development, we tend to try to work on things on the front end so that hopefully by the time we get to the public hearing, we would have incorporated as much stakeholder input as possible, so that, you know, down the line, everything just kind of runs its course. So hopefully on the front end, after we develop our initial drafts, we'll definitely provide opportunity for you guys to comment on the regulations before kind of moving that down the formal process, regulatory process.
Okay. So your schedule, as far as I understand it, this schedule looks like it'd be going past the September date that the CF had specified as far as compliance. Does that mean you guys are getting a waiver from them or something?
Now, in terms of how that plays out, maybe I'll direct attention to maybe Randy. Maybe Randy will be able to pick on that, speaking about kind of the fact that our revision was due May 2017. However, kind of based on our timeline, we're not going to be able to get something submitted formally to the EPA by May 2017. So do we actually ask for like a formal waiver or what?
Typically not.
Okay.
But we will communicate with EPA about timing of our working and moving it through the development process.
Okay. So now, I guess, are there any other questions related to the Maryland Commission on Climate Change, EPA rules, Maryland's timeline? Yes.
This isn't actually related directly to that, but in an earlier slide, I should have asked this then, you said methane from landfills and wastewater treatment plants is 39% of Maryland's methane. Do you have a number that's specific to the landfills?
I can get that number to you.
Okay.
Or, I'm not sure, Chris, if you're able to speak on that.
I don't have the number off the top of my head, no.
But it's definitely in Maryland's 2014 greenhouse gas emission report, it breaks it down by sector, and one would be able to look at the methane emissions and kind of make that kind of.
Okay, I can just look it up myself.
I do know that relative to Maryland's overall total greenhouse gas emissions, it's very, very small.
Can you go to the University of Maryland slide so one of the things that perked my ears up was the little discussion that took place, the one after. So I totally agree with and understand the argument that the aircraft are not going to be able to pinpoint a specific landfill when what maybe is a relatively small area that's really being looked at. And I heard a couple things that said there might be other methane sources close by that might be significantly impacting that. But I'm thinking we don't have those in our inventory. Is that right?
I can just add a little bit to that. I had a conversation with some of you of them. There are a lot of old landfills that are oftentimes near the existing county landfill that may have been run by somebody else, but are there because they're in that industrial neck of the woods. An example here is Quarantine Road. He said there's at least 7 other landfills of various kinds. Some methane generators, some not. But there's a lot of other things around all of them. Brown Station, there's Brown Station A and B. B is lined and A is capped and has gas extraction and energy generation from the gas. Well, there's also an old closed pre-1980 rubble landfill across the street, not capped. So every single one of them, they tended to put landfills in industrial areas. So it's not uncommon, at least, to have other older facilities at different levels of environmental control and different ownerships. It's not the county's landfill. It just happens to be next to the county's landfill. That may not show up on anybody's list except maybe ours. Maybe ours.
Very helpful, thank you. So to the University of Maryland folks, is there a way to do surface level screening to sort of get a feel for that?
So if landfill is located right next to each other, then it's really hard to differentiate from aircraft data set. But as you suggested, if we have some local sensors monitoring the continuous emissions from specific landfills, then that information will be very helpful to differentiate to aircraft data set. But just using the aircraft data set, that's really hard to separate.
Yeah, I get that. That's what I was asking. Could we use some sensors to maybe ask some of the questions that to sort of lay it out? Is we have all. We'll follow up because I'd be interested in getting a better picture of what the general area that we're looking at has and what might be going on.
But the managers of each of those facilities will be glad to give you a whole list of their local facilities that they would suspect to point things out. It's them, it's not us. And I'm sure everybody knows, the managers of those facilities know what's in their vicinity. You guys may not be there. Ed will know, but that would be the case. I would believe that, if you ask, I'm sure they'll be glad to point fingers to everybody else they can think of who might be your potential source. And then you have a full list, and then you just have to be able to cross off and say, no, that was a red herring, and that was a red herring, and this is a closed landfill, but it's too old to be monitored or have a gas system, but it is giving off gas. The EPA list, for the voluntary greenhouse gas reporting that was just due today, they have a list, but they also have a list of who put in their paperwork to say that they're exempt. And those numbers aren't tracked.
In the spirit of your offer, without getting into the pointing fingers thing, to the extent that folks wanted to submit or just tell us, in the spirit of understanding what this research sort of is saying, what else we might need to be looking at in that area, we would be very appreciative. So feel free to send us your lists.
Yes, that would be very helpful to us in analyzing this work if we had such a list of potential other sources.
How are you going to separate A from B?
I'm familiar with some, and I'm sure you might be as well. The Environmental Defense Fund partnered with Google to install some pretty good equipment, maybe equivalent to the stuff that's mounted in airplanes, in Google cars. And they take into consideration the mixing effect at the surface level, and they can distinguish between a large and a small leak in a pipeline. So I can imagine that this might be an applicable tool to drive around
the vicinity of these landfills and maybe identify some of the actual sources. It's published research, and I read the paper. It looks, pretty good. Yeah. And just so everyone knows, again, this is not an NDE project, but starting in 2017, Johns Hopkins and Yale are conducting a 3-year study, mostly focused on Baltimore City and the directly surrounding areas that will be using these new sensors to look at a whole host of air pollutants, including methane. So there's going to be additional data. So I guess everybody will laugh. Leo she'll probably beat me up later. But Leo sues me all the time. So we have a good working relationship. Anyway, if you would have asked me about 5 years ago whether I'm going to be spending a lot of time looking at methane, I would have laughed at you. But here we are 5 years later with methane being a huge issue because of climate change. We didn't go through that, but the reason methane is such a big issue is that it's a very potent greenhouse gas. And to the extent you can address methane relatively quickly, it's like getting 2-for-1 bonus point. If you can deal with your methane because it's so potent early, it makes your long-term goals much easier. We didn't get into that, but that's one of the big drivers behind why so many of the environmental advocacy groups are really pushing methane as a really high priority. Most of our work is all focused on reducing CO2 emissions from power generation and vehicles. But this methane piece has come on in the last 3 years as perhaps something that's as or more important than the CO2 piece, at least in the beginning of the process. So anyway. So look, we're happy to follow up. We're going to probably schedule another meeting when we have a draft reg, probably a couple months away. If in the interim, anybody has questions they want to follow up with, let us know. If you wanted to schedule a session specifically on a piece of the NSPS or with the University of Maryland folks on the research, let me know. But anyway, we're out. We have 3 regulatory initiatives like this on methane, landfills, wastewater treatment plants, and compressor stations. So you're not alone, but they, from an inventory perspective, show up as being very important. That's why we're moving towards trying to see what we can do to tighten up on our regulatory requirements. So,
one curious question to the operators. In terms of the federal NSPS or emission guidelines, were there any concerns with any portion of the rule that you guys had? Okay, so it seems like pretty much the federal rules, landfill operators are comfortable with the language and the requirements.
Well, we'd rather not have to, at the moment we're in a voluntary situation, and we'd rather not have to walk the landfill, and if we could avoid that, we'd love to. That is one thing. The other interesting thing is, and I'll throw this out, and that's, you may get pushback on that. We have a closed landfill that does not have enough gas to run its collection system 24 hours a day. And so, but when we ran our numbers, we had if we were to shut it down, we would have huge amounts of fugitive gases. So we then, instead of just shutting the system down, now put the system on, we had a system on timer of 12 hours on, 12 hours off. And then we looked at it and said, well, at the end of 12 hours, the pipe is now under pressure. So there's been little bit of gas filled up that after 12 hours down, we have pressure. So we've actually installed a double timer on it so that we run 6 hours on, 6 hours off, 6 hours on, 6 hours off. And we actually measure the header pipe at the end of the 6 hours, and we're still under a trace of vacuum, which means that we're not emitting stuff just by changing. We're still running it the same, we're still burning the same amount of gas, and we're still charging the taxpayers the electricity cost to burn this thing. But we're under a vacuum condition at the end of the 6 hours off, which means we're not generating as much fugitive. The landfill is still, as a sponge, holding on to the gas that is otherwise. So getting back to you in the regulations, when you look at that thing where it says, can we shut down our system because we don't have enough time, there may be something where you want to say they need to be able to address, have they done anything to try and keep the system running? As opposed to let's just shut it down and go away, and we'll have to have fugitives for the other stuff that we couldn't capture. You know, that every little bit helps, right? So if they could, did you understand where I'm going with that?
Yeah.
If you could catch them before they get a full shutdown, you know, show us that you've at least tried to be able to use that existing system that you have there a little bit longer.
Hi, this is Jesse Maxwell at Swana. Sorry, who asked that original question?
I'm sorry, what was your question?
So, who asked the question about what other things? The landfill industry?
Howard County raised the issue.
Howard County, okay. I actually
Raised the issue of the timer as just a simple solution to keep a system up and running when you're running just on that edge of running out of gas.
Okay. But I'm sorry, who asked the question about what we were interested in?
Joshua Chauvain with the Regulations Development Division.
Okay, sorry, that's what I was trying to go for. I actually have a fairly involved answer with that. Would I be able to send or talk or set up some sort of meeting in regards to that specifically?
Most definitely. And I'm going to post my contact information, which is at the end of the presentation. So you can send it there in case you're joining via webinar.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, SWANA and some other organizations, major industry players have reviewed the rules and have sort of set up a list of issues that we've seen that would that could be addressed at the state level. So I'd like to get that in your hands.
Okay, sounds good. And your name, sir?
Oh, this is Jesse Maxwell with SWANA.
Okay. Thanks, Jesse.
Thank you.
I just have a real quick question. This is Bruce Odell from Brown Station. What's the chance of us getting a copy of this presentation?
We're going to post this webinar and also the presentation within the next few days. So I'll send out a follow-up link to, if you're on our stakeholder list, you'll receive a link to the place where this PowerPoint will be posted.
Okay, thank you.
You can set up a site on our website for the stakeholder process.
Yeah,
so we'll have our MD Edens, Tad Aburn, our MDE webpage has a link to stakeholder processes, and we will be putting all the materials from these stakeholder processes onto that website. So any additional stuff from University of Maryland, we can put it up there. Anything that anybody else wants us to put up, send it to us. So anyway, let us know.
All right, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. We appreciate you coming to Montgomery Park on a rainy Friday afternoon. That's above and beyond the call of duty. So thank you all.